Welcome to Trust Issues, a podcast by Kepler Trust Intelligence. Please be aware that there can be a time lag when we release podcasts, meaning time-sensitive information may no longer be accurate at the time of publication. Also note that past performance is not a reliable indicator of future results. The value of investments can fall as well as rise, and you may get back less than you invested when you decide to sell your investments. It's strongly recommended that if you are a private investor, independent financial advice should be taken before making any investment or financial decision.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Trust Issues, a podcast from Kepler Trust Intelligence. This week, I'm joined by Andrew Batson, who is the Director for China Research at Gavekal. So, Andrew, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so maybe before we get started, I'll just start with a small anecdote. So I went to Malaysia about 6 months ago, and when I was there, a friend of mine from Hong Kong happened to be there at the same time, so we met up. And over the course of we went out for dinner and so on. Over the course of dinner, he kept complaining about small little things that were happening in Hong Kong and China at the time, and every time he was complaining about something, I would say, why are they doing that? Why is this the policy? And it went from sort of mundane things to more serious things. And it eventually got to the point where he went, like, if you try to understand these policies, you're just going to go insane. So it's better to just accept them as they are and try and live your life accordingly. So maybe what we're trying to do is insane today. I'm not sure. But what we're going to look at is basically, I guess, Chinese policy and sort of reopening and things like that, and what's been going on over the past couple of years. So maybe to get started, could you talk a bit about why you think Chinese policy for COVID was so restrictive, and also why there was this sudden change? I mean, I think for most people who are not keen watchers of the country, it felt like there was this really strict policy that was hard to understand, and then a very quick reversal that was equally hard to understand. So maybe you could talk a bit about both.
Sure. I mean, I think the reversal is probably easier to understand because they had no choice, right? They were forced into changing policy. So the COVID controls were breaking down, and they could either insist that people, local governments, companies continue to follow these extreme measures which weren't working, or they could recognize that they weren't working and tell people, okay, fine, we're not going to do it anymore. So I think the reversal was basically forced on them by the realities of what was happening with the pandemic, which is basically that the virus had become so infectious that it was extremely difficult to control, even with the very strict measures that China employed. The local governments were in charge of actually enforcing these measures, had kind of different levels of competence and enthusiasm for enforcing these measures. So some local governments were quite good at it, and then others, really weren't that good at it, or really didn't want to do it for whatever reason. And because some local governments, weren't that good at restricting the spread of COVID spread. And so the weak parts of the system basically undermined the strong parts of the system, and eventually the whole thing came crashing down. So yeah, for the policy change, it's not something I think that was really decided in a considered way at the top. I mean, of course, they try to portray it that way, but that's, if you look at the sequence of events of what happened, that's not actually how it played out. They were trying to retain the COVID systems, but they basically just fell apart, and so they had no choice but to give up and say, okay, we're opening up. So for the first part of the question is, like, why did they do all this stuff in the first place? I think a lot of it is just path dependency. they I think they got trapped into a uh, certain set of policies, certain set of preconceptions that were difficult to get out of. I mean, in 2022, right, it was very popular for people to criticize China's COVID policies, and everyone's like, "Oh, why are they doing this crazy stuff?" If you think back to the first half of 2021, actually China's policies were looking pretty good. The lockdowns in 2020 had effectively stamped out COVID, so there was no domestic transmission of COVID in China. Unlike everywhere else in the world, they had substantially reopened domestically. So for many people, daily life had returned. The economy was booming, and they had gotten this economic boom, without having to borrow and spend in the way that a lot of the Western governments were. So they had a huge economic boom, low inflation, and not a big increase in government debt. So they didn't overstimulate the economy. So actually, the set of trade-offs that China made at that point in time was looking pretty good. And so I think their strategy was essentially, okay, we've licked this thing. We're still, closed off from the outside world because we want to prevent new infections from coming in. But basically, what we'll do is have a vaccination campaign that will achieve herd immunity. And then once we achieve herd immunity, we can sort of gradually open up, and then everything will be fine. And then, of course, what happened is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus continued to evolve into new variants, and these variants were so transmissible that basically herd immunity became impossible. And I don't think that they were prepared for that. So there wasn't an alternative strategy to achieving herd immunity. So because they had this set of restrictions, the only thing they could do, I think they felt, was to continue with them in order to not have a massive wave of COVID infections and deaths, which of course is what they have just experienced.
Okay, so it's all very interesting. I mean, I think from the point of view of someone who's casually looking at what's going on in China, I think 2 points tended to come out. So one of them was basically that the Chinese manufactured vaccine was not particularly effective, and that part of the reason they didn't want to open up was basically because they didn't want to look bad by using Western-made ones. And at the same time, I think you did have some protests, which seems, again, to someone that's a casual observer, something that's quite unusual in China. So, do you think those things had any role to play, or are those misconceptions?
I think people outside China may focus too much on the vaccine issue. It's true that the evidence that we have suggests that the Chinese vaccines were less effective than the mRNA vaccines developed outside China. But all of the vaccines, whether Chinese or Western made, had some efficacy in reducing death rates and rates of serious illness. What they were not good at was reducing transmission of the virus. And the policy goal that China had set was not just that they did wanted to have low death rates from the virus, but they didn't want to have transmission of the virus. So I think from their perspective, neither the Western vaccines nor the Chinese vaccines could really achieve the goal of stamping out transmission of COVID. I mean, it's definitely true that they didn't want to use the Western vaccines, essentially for political reasons, and I think reasons of international face. But in the end, I don't think it was the choice between a Chinese vaccine or Western vaccine that determine the path that they were on. In terms of, and your second question about the protest, I do think that the protest had a very very clear impact on COVID policy. If you look at various indicators, what was going on. So at our firm, we put together a daily indicator of COVID policies. So my colleagues basically did this heroic work of looking every day at the actual measures announced by 100 different city governments, and then kind of classifying them according to how severe they were. And so if you look at that data series that we compiled, you see that the restrictiveness of COVID policies begins to immediately decline after the protests, right? Before the central government had officially announced any change in policy. Right? So it's clear that the actual implementers of COVID policy, which are the local governments, responded to the popular discontent. And if you don't have access to this, another way you can see the same thing is just to look at the test results data, so the number of COVID cases. So what's kind of counterintuitive is that immediately after the protest, the number of COVID cases plunges. And this, of course, doesn't reflect reality because the pandemic was spiraling out of control at that point. But what it means is that a lot of local governments essentially stopped doing tests. Right? They stopped doing mandatory tests, which again are part of the whole COVID control system. So you can see very clearly in the data that the government immediately began to back off from the most restrictive policies in the face of these popular protests. So I think there's no question that had a real impact.
Okay, well, maybe to move on a bit, most people now are talking about the China reopening trade quite often, but without much detail as to what that really means. So, could you talk about maybe in more tangible terms what is happening at the moment? I think the impression we have a bit is that there's been the sudden reopening and suddenly cases are spiking, which may be causing some problems, and then at the same time that the government is also doing some things to try and get the economy moving again. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the progress of the COVID epidemic, there's very little data now. So they've stopped publishing testing data, which had already become unreliable. There's no real data on deaths or these. The China CDC has published some indicators. So most of these show that cases spiked in December, which was immediately after the controls were lifted, and that the peak was kind of sometime in late December, and then the case numbers have come down substantially since then. So, and that is supported both by sample testing, hospitalization data, and other things. Of course, we don't have any independent data sources to contest the official narrative, but it seems to be well supported. So what happened was that by the beginning of December, there was basically no COVID controls. Given the infectiousness of the virus, it spread, and the fact that the Chinese population was basically immunologically naive, had no built-in resistance, very little vaccine protection. So it swept extremely rapidly through the population. I think all the indications are that a lot of people have died as a result. I don't think that we'll ever know the true death toll, as doctors have been discouraged from reporting COVID as a cause of death, and so the system is I think very deliberately trying to minimize casualties. But it is nonetheless the case that it seems that the kind of initial wave was probably in its last stages by the first part of January, and what you're seeing basically is a return to something pretty close to normal. So the biggest effect of COVID restrictions within China was on mobility, so short and long distance travel. And you've seen those indicators bounce back up to, as of before the Chinese New Year, something like 80% of pre-COVID levels. And the last time I checked the charts, they had continued to improve after the Chinese New Year holiday. So basically, what the reopening is that the fundamental phenomenon is that you had a set of restrictions that artificially suppressed consumption, particularly of services, so travel and recreation, restaurants, these kind of things. And now that those restrictions are gone, the consumption of those things is returning back to normal levels, and that repressed consumptions. It's a pretty substantial share of GDP, and so I think it's quite reasonable to think that we're going to have a bounce in growth as all of the kind of normal activities and consumer spending that were not taking place during the period of COVID restrictions start to take place again.
Okay. I mean, maybe to touch on something else I think people have been concerned about, which is the real estate sector. So I think that came on people's radars probably a year and a half ago with Evergrande almost defaulting, or did default. But that still seems like a potentially huge risk. So there's things I've seen where apparently projects are either being scrapped, or they're even, according to one of our readers, they're even destroying projects because they want to keep a handle on the market. Most, as far as I'm aware, most Chinese have their savings in real estate as well. You can correct me if I'm wrong there. So is that a bubble that's about to burst? Is there a huge amount of risk there? Can you just talk about what's happening in the real estate sector?
Well, what's happened in the real estate sector last year was basically the biggest correction in housing sales and construction in the history of the modern Chinese property market. So you had something like 50% declines in new construction volumes, 30% decline in housing sales volumes. So we're not in a situation where we're waiting for bad things to happen. Like very bad things have already happened. So the question is whether bad things continue to happen, or whether they get less, whether they get less bad. Yeah, I think this the extraordinary collapse in the real estate sector again is kind of a confluence of things that people expected and things that people didn't expect. So you've had this regulatory crackdown on property developers underway since about 2017. Basically, the central government had decided, I think quite correctly, that property developers were a major source of financial risk because they were running highly leveraged business models, and were basically incentivized to build too much housing. So the government financial regulators have been trying different ways to try to constrain the risk-taking behavior of property developers over the last several years, and for I think the first 2 or 3 years of this campaign, from 2017 to 2019, it was kind of partially effective, but not that effective in really changing property developer behavior. Then, of course, we have the COVID interlude in 2020 and 2021. This campaign comes back with a vengeance, and they came up with some very tough, very restrictive measures that really reduced property developers' access to finance, and started to have pretty serious effects on their business. And as the industry was sort of feeling the effects of this in early 2022, got this exogenous shock from the Shanghai lockdown, right? Where the COVID restrictions that had been fairly light up to that point became extremely strict all over again, and this created a lot of uncertainty among people. So basically, everyone in China was like, "Well, we thought this stuff was over. We thought all these restrictions were kind of going to gradually go away, and now it seems like they're never going to go away, and it's going to be here forever, and this is terrible." So you had a kind of collapse. You had a collapse in property sales that happened. In part because of the lockdown and the collapse in household confidence, and then that was also driven at the same time. So it's kind of difficult to disaggregate these things, but it's driven by the same time by the deteriorating financial state of the developers, where, as you pointed out, they became unable to complete projects, and that made people understandingly reluctant to hand over a lot of money to developers. So with this sharp collapse in property sales that happened in the first half of last year, this was basically the death blow for developers who are already under extreme financial stress from the loss of external financing. So it's one thing, find it more difficult to, borrow from banks or to issue bonds, but the main way that developers finance their business is by selling houses. If they're not selling houses, then they really don't have any money, and they didn't have any access to external finance to make up the gap. So that imposed a huge financial stress on developers. They not only had to stop, work on existing projects, but they massively cut back, all the new construction purchase of land for future construction, simply because they didn't have any money. They had no money from sales coming in the door, and they couldn't borrow it. So what's happened, over the last few months is that, kind of simultaneously with this relaxation of COVID policy, is that the government has kind of come around slowly, and I think somewhat reluctantly, but it has nonetheless come around to the view that it kind of overdid things by trying to crush the developers with financial regulation, and that the macro effects of this are just too severe. So the priority now is to get housing sales going again, restore kind of normal funding channels to developers, and prevent a kind of further collapse in the state sector. And I think that's kind of where we are now. So what the market is going to be looking for over the next weeks and months is some indication that property sales are going to normalize. They may not ever go back to their pre-COVID levels, but but if they increase a little bit, that will make a big difference to the financial situation for developers and help kind of halt this free fall in construction activity.
Okay. So do you think that the sort of risk has gone and passed, or from some of the reading I've done around it, the amount of debt that seems to be in that system is just huge. So do you think that there could still be a sort of 2008 style crisis for Chinese property on the horizon, or do you think that it's already kind of happened in the past 5-6 years, as you mentioned?
Well, we've already had a huge correction in construction activity. I don't think construction activity in China is ever going to go back to its previous levels. So we've had a crisis, and the effects of the crisis are going to be felt for a long time. The question is how long does the kind of state of affairs from last year go on? I think one way of thinking about this risk is that a lot of it in China really comes down to the attitude of the government. If the attitude of the government is that we don't like property developers, and we think your business should be smaller than it is now, that's not a very good environment for property developers, right? Because the financial regulators, the local governments, everyone that they deal with is going to feel this attitude that's been set by the top, and then it filters through the system. And that's going to, and I think it is significant. Government, again, reluctantly, and I think they've tried to keep a lot of the things that they're doing somewhat out of the public eye, but they have accepted basically that the macro risk from a collapse in the property sector is very severe, and they need to deliver direct support to developers instead of just standing back, being hands off, and saying, "Oh, this is not our problem. If you guys collapse, it's on you." So I think there has been a clear shift in the direction of government policy, and that does change the balance of risks. So I think what a lot of people are concerned about is the remaining risks is, basically what's the attitude of households towards the property market? Are households still worried about the financial condition of developers? Do they still think it's too risky to hand over, a big chunk of their life savings to a developer for a housing unit they won't even receive for another 2 or 3 years? Or has their perception of that risk changed? And of course, we don't know the answer to that yet, but the behavior of property sales over the next few weeks and months will certainly give us some clues.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things you touched on there was effectively how government has quite a big role in influencing outcomes in China, which I suppose is true in every country, right? But I think
particularly so in China, yeah.
Yeah, but so I think one of the things that has confused investors or people in general, to go back to the story I told at the beginning, were some of the regulatory crackdowns, which I think you touched on maybe in your answer just then. So I think it seemed particularly pronounced in 2021, where there was like the ban on private tutoring. You have the IPO, I think, of Ant being scrapped in that year as well. There were things like limits on video games, I think, how much time children could spend on video games and when they could watch them. So I suppose I have two questions there. So one is there some kind of overarching goal that dictates policy in this case, right? So as in, is the same goal in mind when they're doing things like making Ant not IPO and stopping teenagers from playing too many video games, or is it sort of done on a case by case basis where they go, okay, we don't want, this will be bad for reason X, and this will also be bad, but for a totally different reason, and therefore we will act in this way. And secondly, I mean, do you have any idea on what drives some of these things? If you're an investor, I think the sense is just that it feels incredibly arbitrary. So is there any kind of indication that something like this is coming, or is it just that? Is it just suddenly there will just be a decision, X has to stop, and therefore it does, and you just kind of have to deal with the consequences?
I mean, I guess these decisions are arbitrary in the sense that it's a decision taken by a bureaucracy that's not that accountable. Is arbitrary the same thing as not having any warning? No, not exactly. I think in a lot of cases there were indications about what issues regulators of various sectors were concerned about before these things happened. But it is certainly the case that a lot of things happened that people in the affected industries either didn't expect or maybe more accurately didn't want to believe. If you look back at again this early period of 2021, or as I mentioned, right, the general vibe in China was things are going great. We've kicked COVID. The economy is booming. We've done what no other economy in the world could do, which was to effectively stamp out COVID and have a strong economic recovery. So there's this huge degree of confidence, not to say hubris, I think among the officials in the Chinese government at that time. And actually, the official documents, like the readouts from Politburo meetings, policy documents in the early part of 2020, said this pretty clearly. They said, right, what's happening in China now is we're having a very strong growth rebound, because we're coming out of this pit from the COVID lockdowns. So we've got incredible growth momentum in the economy right now. And that means for the first time in a while, actually, we don't need to obsess about cyclical economic policy. Right? I mean, everybody's forgotten everything that happened, before COVID in 2020, but actually, the situation for the Chinese economy wasn't particularly great. Growth was slowing, things were kind of blah. So this wonderful boom that happened kind of naturally in 2021 was just fantastic. And they said explicitly, we have a window of opportunity now to do structural reforms that we might not otherwise be able to do because the economy is going gangbusters. It gives us a little more to do this stuff. And this is, when they started to make more concrete some of these big slogans and concepts that the top leader Xi Jinping had been talking about for things like, the list is so long, so self-sufficiency in technology, the common prosperity, the new development pattern, the dual circulation, whatever. So there's a lot of kind of buzzwords and Chinese government jargon here. And these have been kind of floating around for a while. And what really happened in 2021 is those abstract concepts started to be implemented. The rubber hit the road, and people started to figure out like, oh, this is what they really mean. This is what the government really wants. And what the government wanted in many cases is kind of more control over the freewheeling industries, particularly the tech sector. The tech sector had basically been tech sector meaning things to do with the internet. It's essentially been unregulated or very lightly regulated for the last couple of decades. The companies in that sector had gotten quite used to being able to do essentially what they wanted, and sort of notifying the government that yeah, this is what we're going to do, but not really asking for permission. And the general vibe of a lot of those regulatory restrictions was no, you need to go from just telling us what you're going to do to asking us whether you can do it and whether it's a good idea. That's sort of the general shift that happened there.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm curious about is whether the goal of these things is sort of economic or almost cultural and social. So if I think about something like the scrapping of the Ant IPO and how that company was structured, I actually can understand the financial risks involved and why it would make economic sense to stop that from happening. I don't think actually that product would be allowed to in the UK or US. So I can see where they're coming from there. But then if you look at something like private tutoring or restricting people's access to video games, it feels that there doesn't seem to really be an economic incentive there. It just feels like more of controlling people's lives, but I don't really understand for what purpose.
Yeah, I think that's broadly true, right? So not all of these different measures were taken by the same parts of the bureaucracy or had the same targets or had the same goals, right? So there wasn't sort of one overarching goal that then dictated all of these different things that are happening. There's a number of different goals which were kind of unified conceptually, perhaps, but different in practice. So yeah, I think it's and it's very much a characteristic of the Chinese system that the government feels not only entitled to kind of regulate social as well as economic activities, but obliged to. Right? The government's job in China is to ensure that China develops in a positive way. And that's not something that's limited to the economy, right? That's something that encompasses, all aspects of life. So the government feels an obligation to tackle social problems. In this case, um, you know, teenagers like spending like too much time playing video games, or alternatively, too much time, cramming in like after school courses and like, disturbing their normal pattern of development. Right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just it's just a different kind of regulatory concept. It's a different concept of what's the appropriate role of government, like what are the appropriate boundaries. Um, there's not there's not really a kind of dividing line between, oh, it's you know we can regulate things in the economy, but then we don't regulate things that are not in the economy. There's no such line, right? That's all one thing.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about, I mean, how those decisions are made? So something you touched on was the sort of bureaucracy. I've read some arguments, and probably listeners won't agree with this, but some arguments that actually the Chinese bureaucracy is incredibly efficient at finding sort of good people and also incredibly meritocratic. I know that again, most people listening will be very skeptical about that, but that those people are then that I suppose most people's perception of China is that it's a very top-down system and that its power is extremely centralized. But I think from the course of this conversation, right, you talked a lot about how local governments actually enact policies, and also how a lot of decisions aren't really made by some Xi Jinping is not sitting at the top and just telling everyone what to do. There's actually a wider technocratic class, if you want to call it that, around him. So if you took the example of, say, I don't know, again, it feels silly to do it, but let's say if you're looking at something like the video game ban, I mean, how is a decision like that reached? I mean, is there a kind of bureaucracy dealing with social problems among teenagers, and they go, okay, we now have to make this policy, or is it actually much more top down than I'm suggesting it is?
Yeah, I'm actually not particularly well informed about video game regulations, so I don't know that I can speak to the policy making process there. I Yeah, just in more general terms, I think China, historically, and I've been working on China for more than 20 years, so I've seen that a few things come and go. China historically is pretty decentralized in the way most decisions are made. So a lot of uh, local governments who, um, of course, have authority over like millions and tens of millions of people. So they're not small entities at all. Uh, have a lot of authority. Different parts of the bureaucracy also, make their own decisions. There's a lot of consultation between businesses and the government. So China is not that good at formal transparency of regulations and policy decisions, but there is a level of informal transparency where regulators will meet with people in regulated industries, and they talk about stuff, and companies get guidance about what regulators like and don't like, and kind of what's coming down the pike. Um, so, I, but what has changed, I think, in the perception of a lot of people, inside and outside China, over the last decade or so, that Xi has been in power, is that it has become a bit more top-down. The room to maneuver of individual government agencies and individual local governments has been somewhat circumscribed. Um, they are under a lot more pressure to do things that clearly adhere to the priorities articulated by the center, and they suffer serious risks if they are found not to be complying with policy priorities. Right? They can be, convicted for corruption and go to jail and lose their job, or lose their life. Right? So downside risks for being a government official in China are actually quite serious.
Yeah, can imagine.
Yeah. So there, yes. So I think what people are experiencing and kind of reacting to over the last few years is a shift from a more decentralized, more, I don't want to say bottom up, but sort of more consultative governing style to one that is a little bit more top down, where instructions, flow down a pyramid from the top levels to the lower levels, and there's less feedback, going up, and they're going up the pyramid. So that seems to be the feeling of a lot of participants in the Chinese system. I realize that's kind of general. And there is a lack of transparency about how decisions are made generally in China, so it's hard to get super precise about it. But I think everyone agrees that is something like that is roughly the case.
Yeah, I think another thing that perhaps partly because of COVID and also because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that people have forgotten, or sort of it's more at the back of their mind than it would have been previously, is the tensions between the US and China. So the past couple of months, you've seen some China seems like it's done some things to lure foreign investment away. So you had, I think, in December they finally reached an agreement about U.S. listings of ADRs, basically having more transparency with their accounts and things. But nonetheless, it still seems to be the case that that is going to be an ongoing problem, right? So I think of something like sanctions on you know, China and their ability to access semiconductors and things like that. So I'm curious what you think the dynamics there are at the moment, and what is likely to happen going forward, and what China is doing, if anything, to sort of prepare itself or defend itself against sanctions and things like that.
I mean, I don't think this is a secret. It's the declared priority of the Chinese government over the last 3 to 4 years is that they need to um, become more self-sufficient in science and technology and reduce the ability of external actors, uh, particularly the U.S., to affect China's own development of science, technology, and industry. So that is the number one top priority in the 5-year plan. It's the top priority that's mentioned in every speech by Xi Jinping. The Politburo Standing Committee just had their first study session in the new year. She gave them the speech. Again, we've got to improve our self-sufficiency, our autonomy in science and technology. We've got to reduce the vulnerability of China to these choke points countries and governments have leverage. So, there is a whole of society, a whole of government effort to address this problem, which they think is very serious, that has been underway for a few years now, and I think has very broad buy-in across Chinese society and the business sector. You know, Chinese people, Chinese businesses think these U.S. sanctions are a ridiculous abuse of power, an unjustified ability to an unjustified intervention in China's drive to become a richer and more powerful civilization, and they won't stand for it. So all that stuff is pretty clear. It's out there. Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, I'm curious on something like the semiconductor front. Do you see them being capable of actually being able to achieve that sort of self-sufficiency? Because it seems, I mean, I think even most countries will probably struggle to do that, and it seems as though um, they've kind of made some efforts at trying to do it, but I think are kind of struggling.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of what does self-sufficiency mean, right? So I think maybe we can distinguish between relative self-sufficiency and absolute self-sufficiency. So I think for a product like semiconductors, which are the one of the most complex devices ever manufactured by human beings. The idea of absolute self-sufficiency for any country is just illusory. There's no such thing. It's a very complex industry with very precise, very fine division of labor scattered across the entire globe. So there's no country in the world, including China, that has a fully self-sufficient semiconductor industry. It's not even clear. So I think the idea of absolute self-sufficiency, maybe like some people in China, do actually hold to this idea, but I think most people in the industry know that absolute self-sufficiency is just a fantasy. Doesn't mean the politicians aren't going to try to achieve it, but it's not a real goal that can be achieved. But if we take a less kind of absolutist view, can China become relatively more self-sufficient in semiconductors? Can it rely less on pieces of the global supply chain that are located outside China? Can it have more control over intellectual property that's held domestically within China? And here the answer is clearly yes. Yes, they can relatively increase their self-sufficiency over time. Particularly in the mature parts of the industry where the technology is well understood and spread spread widely across the world. I think it's much more difficult at kind of the leading edge, and that's where a lot of the attention, the media attention, is focused, and a lot of and where the U.S. sanctions in particular are focused. So no, I don't think it's realistic for China to think that in the near term they can become self-sufficient in the leading edge of semiconductor technology. But I'm not sure that's actually the goal. Probably the goal is to become relatively self-sufficient as a broader swath of the industry.
Okay, well, maybe to finish off, I think most people listening to this will be individual investors who are not in China, they're in the UK, and are probably pondering whether or not they should be invested in Chinese companies. I went to an event about 6 months ago, and what was quite interesting was speaking to people. I think it sort of became apparent that after Russia invaded Ukraine, I think a lot of people had this realization of what it means to be invested in a country that is governed in, let's say, a less transparent, more authoritarian way. So if I think of investing in Russia, right, you could talk about how great a company like Yandex is, or Gazprom's dividend, but actually it's kind of irrelevant if a single day all of that can just be wiped out, and you effectively can't predict whether or not that is going to happen. And I think many people had sort of were either thinking already or were starting to wonder whether actually exactly the same thing applies to China. So I'm curious if you have any kind of thoughts around that. Do you think that China is going to be able to maintain or lure back foreign investors this year and moving forward in general?
I mean, the short answer is apparently yes, because the inflows from foreign investors into Chinese domestic stocks had their biggest month of all time in January. So there's been a pretty big change in foreign investor sentiment, at least in the short term. Let me try to give you a little sort of more thoughtful answer on this. Over the years, talking to a lot of our clients, institutional investors, a lot of them were very interested in finding a way to benefit from the long-term growth story of China, but also avoid what they saw as the political risks and lack of transparency involved in the communist system. And a lot of investors, came to the conclusion that the way to do that, to achieve both of those goals, was to buy shares in the Chinese private sector internet companies. So these were companies that were clearly in a growing part of the economy. they were targeting, consumer demand rather than, government spending or SOEs or whatever. And crucially, they were run by, profit-seeking entrepreneurs. They were run by guys who, wanted to make tons of money by, providing like internet services to a billion people. And it seemed that generally the government was okay with that and had given them space to do that. So from a Western investor's perspective, this is sort of the it's the best of all possible worlds. You have all of the Chinese growth potential, and then you have none of like the weird China stuff of state investment and intervention and Communist Party jargon, right? So so really what happened in that regulatory crackdown or whatever you want to call it in 2021 is that this thesis was proved to be wrong. That in fact there wasn't a special sector of the economy that was immune to government influence and where you didn't have to worry about Communist Party slogans or state intervention. In fact, that the internet sector was also vulnerable to these issues, just like every other sector of the Chinese economy. And I think that was a pretty big shock for a lot of people who had hoped that the internet sector was going to be different. So, and of course, the internet companies have had a very nice rally since late last year. So obviously, a lot of investors are happy to own those shares once again. But I do think that the kind of change in mindset or the change in the perception about how China works is a permanent one. So I don't think that people are going to go back to this view that here's this sector of the Chinese economy where I don't have to worry about government influence and I can just put my money in and kind of forget about it and not pay attention to what's going on. So I don't think that kind of strategy is coming back, but could still be the case that the internet companies that their shares have a lot of upside from here because they got quite beaten down, and the short-term policy tone has definitely shifted there.
Okay, well, an uncertain note on which to finish. So, Andrew, thanks very much. Thanks very much for doing this, and hopefully in the future we can do it again and enjoy further common prosperity or something like that. Anyway.
Yes, indeed. Look forward to it.